Up next is I Live in Your Basement. Marco sneaks off to a softball game without his mother's permission because she's completely paranoid. And this tough girl, her name is Gwynny, she's practicing her swings. Marco walks up at just the wrong time and he gets slammed in the head with the softball bat. Marco wakes up and he's got his head all bandaged up. He's got a nasty bruise. He's laying on his couch and his mother's freaking out. Marco gets a phone call. Marco answers it, and there's a boy on the phone saying that his name is Keith and he lives in Marco's basement. Once Marco's mom comes back, he tries to tell her about this, and she says, "That's impossible. There's not even a phone in this room." And the next night, Marco can't sleep. So he goes to fix himself a late night snack, and he sees that the basement door is open, and it's usually closed. And then he's hearing footsteps. He says, "Who's there?" And he thinks that he hears Keith again. And then Marco's mom is down there in the basement, and she's doing laundry. And Marco is freaking out. He says, "There's someone down here, Mom." And of course she brushes it off. And then he hears again Keith saying, "Listen to your mother." And a few days later, Marco goes back to school, and the teacher wants him to stand up in front of the class and talk about his experience at the hospital. And he can't think of anything. He woke up on his couch. He didn't remember going to the hospital at all. He's a little weirded out by that. He wonders why he didn't go to the hospital. And after school, Gwynny starts chasing him, seemingly to hurt him again, but not. It turns out she's not really trying to hurt him. But once he arrives at his house, he goes up to his room and he sees a boy sitting on his bed, and he says that he's Keith. And so he kind of freaks out, seeing somebody there that's not supposed to be there. He locks Keith in his room and then tells his mom to come up and check him out. And then he runs back up with his mom, opens the door, and finds that he's locked in the dog, that Keith was never really there. At this point, Marco's mom is getting pretty worried. She takes him to the doctor, and he actually threatens to take out pieces of Marco's brain. And Marco's mom agrees to this, saying that he's a doctor and he knows what he's doing. Marco is saying, "Absolutely not. You're not going to take my brain out." He says, "At least let me think about it," which, is his way of saying, "Let me out of here." They go back home, and Marco, he tries to write his homework, his creative writing assignment. So suddenly the computer just kind of shuts off, and he sees Keith's face again on his monitor. And Gwynny pops up, saying that she wanted to apologize for hitting him in the head with a bat, and that it really was an accident, and she's really sorry for it. And that was why she was chasing him earlier in the book. Marco's like, "Okay, that's all well and good. Look at this computer screen, and look at this boy who's been telling me that he lives in my basement." Gwynny looks at the computer screen and says, "That computer isn't even on." Marco is kind of getting fed up, and so he says, "Okay, Gwynny, come down with me to the basement and we'll find him." He says that she's big and tough, and so he feels much safer with her there, going to look for Keith in the basement. And then this next part is really disturbing. In exquisite detail, the book describes Gwynny throwing up her insides. It talks about how her mouth is gaping open wider and wider, and how things are bubbling up in her mouth, and it turns out it's her organs that she's throwing up onto the floor, and her heart and her lungs and her intestines and everything are passing over her teeth and out of her mouth onto the ground. And the imagery used is so disturbing. It is the most unnerving, the most disgusting imagery used in any Goosebumps book, I'm so sure. And definitely out of the original series. And then Marco, he just starts screaming, understandably. And then he wakes up in the hospital next to his mom. And Gwynny also, but Gwynny is not the big tough girl on campus. Gwynny is Marco's little sister. So Gwynny says, "No, I'm your sister. I didn't hit you in the head with a bat. It was Jeremy, your friend." Marco, he doesn't know what to think. And Marco's doctor comes in after his mom and sister leave. And the doctor grabs Marco's tongue and starts pulling on Marco's tongue. And he keeps pulling and pulling and pulling and stretching Marco's tongue out, just letting it coil onto the ground. And again, this book goes into very disturbing, very exquisite imagery about this event. Marco wakes up again, and now he's in the hospital again. And the doctor, he gives a note to Marco, which is from Keith. It's saying, well, get well soon because I still live in your basement and you still need to take care of me. He tries to talk to his family about it. He says, I got this note from the doctor. Here, doctor, tell them about the note you gave me. And the doctor says, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Marco goes for the letter, and turns out there's no letter. The next morning, Marco goes home, goes upstairs to bed, and he runs into Keith again. Keith transforms into a gelatinous monster, and it surrounds Marco. It envelops him, and it starts to drag him downstairs. Marco manages to break the monster in two, but then he just has two monsters to deal with. And so he's rolling on the ground, screaming. His mom is not seeming to hear him. So Marco is rolling around, and then his mom looks down and it says, what are you doing, Marco? Marco realizes there aren't any of those gelatinous creatures. Marco goes up to his room again, and Keith is waiting for him again. And Marco kind of gives in. He says, okay, Keith, whatever, I'll do what you want. Just please leave me alone. And then Keith also vomits up all of his insides. And then that's the end of another dream sequence. But instead of Marco waking up this time, it's Keith who wakes up. And then Keith's mother comes and says, oh no, it was just a bad dream. Don't worry, just turn yourself inside out and you can go back to sleep. And so Keith, again, vomits up his insides, turns himself inside out, and then Marco comes down the stairs. He sees Keith there, and then Keith looks over at Marco and says, oh no, you're dreaming. And that's the end of the book. I'm going to start on the end again. I find it just ambiguous enough to be open somewhat to interpretation. I try to take a little bit of creative liberty when interpreting the ending of this story. And so that's why I can suspend my disbelief for the ending. This book is the most grotesque imagery you could imagine. And it happens several times over. It goes into gruesomely descriptive detail everything that happens. This book is disgusting and also scary. Very scary. This, I think, might be the scariest book in the original Goosebumps series. It is definitely the most graphic and the most disturbing and the most grotesque and the most gory book in the original series. Definitely. It also adds the aspect of Marco doesn't know what's real anymore. He's caught in this dream after dream after dream loop, and he's trying to sort out what's real and what's not, and you feel his pain as he's going through it. So this is a very good Goosebumps book. Very good. It's phenomenal. And now next is A Night in Terror Tower. Sue and Eddie are in England for the first time, and they are on this tour group to see the Terror Tower, which is basically a tower that they use as a prison and a torture chamber. So they get into all sorts of scary things, scary torture devices, and they are learning about the history of the tower, like the fact that there were a young prince and princess who were locked up in that tower with orders from the king to have them smothered with pillows. And so quite soon in the book, the scariness starts when Sue looks over at the tour group and sees a man standing there who is very ominous and intimidating and foreboding. He's got a wide-brimmed hat on. He's always in shadow. Very tall, very broad, and scary-looking man. She notices that he's constantly staring at her and her brother. And she's kind of wondering, what's this guy doing? What does he keep staring at us for? Why does he keep following us around? Soon after, the tour group, they all go home. But Sue and Eddie, they were distracted and they didn't make it. And so now they're all alone in the tower. And then coming up the stairs after them is this man. And he demands that they come with him. And he brings out these stones that are magic stones. And he starts saying an incantation. And the kids are like, this guy is so weird, run, he's gonna hurt us. So they run. And they come across a torture chamber and come across a very, very atmospheric scene where the man is screaming at them, raging at them from the other side of the door. They find their way out through the sewers. They lose this man who's chasing them. They meet up with a man who says, wow, you guys, why are you so late? Mr. Starks had to pack everybody up and go without you. You were just taking too long. He couldn't keep the people waiting. He says, I'll call a cab for you. And then they get into this cab, drive back to their hotel. And so the driver says, okay, that's going to be X amount of pounds, X amount of pence. Sue hands over the money she has. The cab driver won't accept it. He says that that money is phony and that money isn't any good. So Sue's like, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll go up to the hotel. We'll have our parents come down and pay you. They go up. They are trying to look for their parents. They go into the room. There's nobody in the room. And so they say, okay, something weird is going on here. They should have been out of their meeting by now. They go down to the front desk. And at the front desk, they say, hey, can you help us find our parents? They're supposed to be in room 626. The man says, well, I'm sorry, there's nobody in that room. They say, but that's our room. So he's like, okay, well, we'll find your parents. Let me look them up by their last name. So what's your last name? And then they try to think, but no answer comes to their minds. And they're thinking hard, and they don't remember their last name. And they say, what's wrong with us? We can't have this. They say, well, we're sorry, we can't remember. This man at the front desk, he says, okay, well, I'll do my best. I don't make any promises because don't have any information, but I'll do my best. Okay, wait in the dining room over there. They go to the dining room, and then the taxi driver catches up with them expecting the money. And so they have to be on the run again. They aren't on the run for very long before then they run into the tall, broad, black-caped man again. We find out that Eddie is a master pickpocket, and so he was able to lift the stones from the man down in the sewer where he had grabbed them. So he demands them back. Eddie gives them back, and then he says, okay, now come with me. Then the stones, they start to glow, and then when they finally come to again, they realize that everything looks different. And they find these people who are dressed all old-fashioned, and they realize they aren't in the 20th century anymore. They're still on the run. Eddie just vanishes, and then Sue realizes, oh, the man must have taken him. I've got to run. I've got to hide. She runs, and then she finds this lady. She says, hide me, please. And then the lady is like, I can't. Sue says, okay, I'll pay you. Here, take this money. And it's the money that the taxi driver refused. Lady takes the money and recognizes it as gold sovereigns. And she says, okay, here, hide in my kindling basket. And then as soon as the man comes in looking for her, she just sells her out and gives her up for the man. She says, I can't go against the Lord High Executioner. And so immediately Sue's thinking, wait a second, the executioner. And you realize that now the executioner has got both Sue and Eddie. So they take Sue up to the cell where they had just taken their tour a while back in the 20th century. Eddie is already waiting there. They throw Sue in, and then they meet this man who kind of looks a little bit like Merlin, I would imagine. His name is Morgred, and he's a sorcerer. He's a wizard, essentially. And he explains to them that they are not Sue and Eddie, but they are Princess Susanna and Prince Edward of York. And so he says that he tried to save them from their execution. He sent them into the future. He gave them new memories. And so that's why they didn't have parents in the 20th century. That's why they couldn't remember their last name. And so he restores their memories to them, and they remember. And then they say, oh, can you please just save us again? He says, I'm sorry, I can't. I don't have my magic stones with me. And turns out Eddie, or at this point Prince Edward, the pickpocket, he took them from the executioner again when they captured him. But he says, I'm sorry, I still can't do it. Morgred reaches in for a hug. He says, I'm sorry. Morgred leaves. And then Edward holds up the stones again. He says, haha, I pickpocketed you again. Now I have the stones. And Edward remembered the incantation that Morgred had just showed them. And he performed that incantation right in the nick of time, right as the door is opening for them to be executed. As the door opens, the spell worked, and the door opens to reveal a tour group. And there the tour guide explains that in this cell that they were standing in, there was a young prince and a young princess. They were named Susanna and Edward. On the night that they were to be executed, they vanished, and no one knows what happened to them. And then Morgred from behind steps up and says, well, I think we know what happened. Thanks for bringing me along. I'm going to be Mr. Morgan now, and I'll be your parent. They say, well, I'll be Sue Morgan, and I'll be Eddie Morgan. Really a nice happy ending. They pretty much live happily ever after, I suppose. But this book is a very good read. I said before that I don't really like time travel stories, but this book did it right. I was very intrigued with this story. I loved the characters. The characters were very likable. The story was very well paced, very well structured. Only a few fake out scares, which I liked. And honestly, it really did have a lot of suspenseful moments. A lot of moments of utter despair. This was a very solid entry in the Goosebumps saga. A very great read, a very entertaining read, and just a really great book. Up next, we have Night of the Living Dummy 2. This story revolves around a little girl named Amy. She has a hobby of ventriloquism, and her dummy, Dennis, is starting to break down from being overused, really. She's trying to get everything right. She's trying to keep Dennis intact, but it's just not working. So she asks her dad, can you get me a new dummy? Her dad eventually gets Slappy for her. Pretty much immediately after that, she inadvertently brings Slappy to life by reading the words Carew, Marie, Odana, Loma, Malonu, Carano. And all sorts of stuff happens through the entirety of this book. All sorts of very unsettling, creepy, scary things. Slappy comes to life while she's trying to do her routine in front of her family. And it starts saying mean things about all their insecurities, like making fun of the dad for being bald, making fun of the mom for being a little overweight, making fun of her sister's artwork, and her brother's intelligence, I guess. Slappy at one point destroys one of Sarah's paintings, Sarah being Amy's sister. At one point, Slappy gets physically violent, just punches Amy's father, and for all of these things, Amy is getting blamed. And Amy, of course, she swears up and down that she didn't do it. So then she decides that she's going to prove it by having the parents see him. And so they have a plan to dress up Jed, their little brother, as the dummy Dennis, hoping that once Slappy sees Dennis walking around, it'll shock him long enough so that they can grab him and hold him down and show their parents. So that night when they're putting their plan into action, they do see Jed tackle Slappy, and he knocks Slappy's head onto Sarah's bedpost and breaks Slappy's head in two. And then Jed, he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to set my alarm. What happened?" And then the twist is, if it wasn't Jed, then who was it who took down Slappy? Of course, there's far more detail than that in the story. Just hitting the basic points of this story, it's very concise. It gets into the real terror a lot faster than any of the other Night of the Living Dummy installments, and is equally as terrifying, in some cases even more. And this is the first book to really focus around Slappy, which is a really great thing, just to see Slappy in all his glory, in all his terrible, terrible glory. Very good book. One of my favorites, easily. Up next is The Haunted Mask. This book centers around Carly Beth, who is a scaredy cat, really. And she keeps getting picked on by Steve and Chuck. Steve and Chuck at one point put a worm in her sandwich that Carly Beth eats. She freaks out. She's sick of being picked on. That was just the last straw, and she runs home and she plots her revenge. She finds that her mom has crafted a plaster of Paris bust of her. And she says, "Wow, that's really nice, Mom." And then her mom says, "I did it because I love you." She also made Carly Beth a duck costume, but Carly Beth doesn't want to go as a duck. She wants to go as something scary in order to scare the actual crap out of Steve and Chuck. Get them back for all the times that they've been mean to her. So she remembers that a new shop has just opened, and she plans to go get a mask that's really scary. So the day before Halloween, after Chuck and Steve have made her think that a tarantula has gotten loose and bit her, Carly Beth runs in tears. She runs away. She's totally had enough. She's really sick of it. So Halloween day, she pulls all of her money together, about $30, which is her life savings, and she goes to this new shop that's opened. And she finds a whole bunch of mediocre masks and somewhat scary things. But she finds a back room to the shop, and there she sees a whole bunch of really scary, terrifying masks. The owner initially refuses to sell her one of the masks. He says, "No, I'm not going to sell you these masks. They're too frightening, they're too real, they're too special." And Carly Beth is just begging, pleading to get one of these masks. And eventually the store owner kind of gives in. He says, "Okay, fine, $30. And she forks over the money, and she grabs one of the masks that's really scary. And so she decides she's going to test it out on her brother. She puts the mask on and starts roaring at her brother, making this terrible voice come out of her mouth. And her brother Noah is kind of like, "Carly Beth, please take that mask off. I don't like it. I don't like what you're doing with your voice. You're really scaring me. Please stop." So she takes it off, and she said, "I got a new mask. What do you think? I'm going to go scare these two evil pranksters with it." So she goes out into the night on Halloween, and she puts the mask on again. So Carly Beth grabs this plaster of Paris bust that her mother had made of her, and she goes off looking for Chuck and Steve, looking to scare them. Sabrina meets up with her and notes that Carly Beth is acting really strange. And she's acting like a completely different person. And as this is going on, something is taking over her. Something is really taking over Carly Beth and making her really evil. So she starts doing things that she normally wouldn't do. Like she starts frightening innocent children. She at one point, I think she even like vandalizes somebody's property. Eventually, though, she gets separated from Sabrina, and she goes to find Chuck and Steve to put her plan into action. So she finds Chuck and Steve, and she scares them really bad, and she holds up the plaster bust, and it actually speaks. And this bust is imploring Steve and Chuck, saying, "Help me." After that, Chuck and Steve, they're gone. That scared them so bad that they just ran away, and they promised never to hurt Carly Beth again. After scaring them so badly, Carly Beth takes that plaster bust of herself, and she just leaves it behind. She says, "I don't need this anymore. This isn't who I am anymore. I'm not this pitiful, scarable, wimpy Carly Beth anymore." So she meets back up with Sabrina, goes back to Sabrina's house with her, and she tries to take the mask off, and it's not coming off. So realizing that the mask won't come off, Carly Beth starts losing her mind. She's screaming. She's saying, "Get it off me right now. I don't want this mask on anymore. Halloween is over. Get it off. Get it off." Sabrina is looking for the bottom of the mask, and she can't find it. Carly Beth is looking for it. She can't find it either. She goes into the mirror, and she sees her reflection, and it's not her eyes that are looking at her. She freaks out, utterly freaks out. She runs back to the store where she got the mask, and she's begging to the store owner, saying, "Please help me. I gotta get this mask off. How do I get it off?" And he said, "Yeah, I was expecting you. I was waiting for you here all night." And then, again, R.L.Stine's explanations, they kind of are a big letdown, and they kind of hurt the story. He says that that mask isn't a mask, that it's a real face, and that he worked in a lab where he designed faces to be beautiful, but something went wrong, and the masks or the faces turned into very ugly faces. And he says that the mask can only be removed now with a symbol of love. And Carly Beth, she starts racking her brain. Okay, a symbol of love. What can I use as a symbol of love to get this mask off? And then she thinks back to that plaster bust that her mom made because she loves her so much. And at this point, she looks over to the masks and sees them starting to float up, and they start chasing her as she's trying to get away, trying to find that plaster bust again. And so they're pursuing her all the way until she finally finds this plaster bust. And then she takes it and she pulls it over the mask. And then with that symbol of love, the mask flee away, and she's finally able to take the mask off. But the shopkeeper warned her, said if that thing attaches itself to any other face now, it's going to be permanent. There's going to be no way whatsoever to get it off. So Carly Beth, so relieved, she goes home. She drops the mask by the door, doesn't think twice about it, doesn't ever want to see the mask again. And she runs to give her mom a big hug. And she's just so happy to be herself again. And then Noah, Carly Beth's brother, runs in the room, and he says, "How do I look in your Halloween mask, Carly Beth?" And that's the end of the book. This book, it's pretty much blasphemy to Goosebumps for this book not to be in like your top 5, at least your top 10. This book is amazing. It is definitely among R.L.Stine's best work. This book is very emotional, it's very concise. Carly Beth is probably the most likable protagonist in the entire Goosebumps saga, in the entire Goosebumps legacy. Every Goosebumps book ever, Carly Beth is probably the one that people sympathize the most with. Every emotion that this book wants you feel it, and you feel it hard. It has great moments of scariness, great moments of tenderness, everything. Almost everything in this book is exactly as it needs to be. This book is truly amazing. And now, for my favorite Goosebumps book in the original series and possibly of all time, The Headless Ghost. So this book centers around Dwayne and Stephanie, who are best friends, and they like to scare everybody in the neighborhood. They kind of take it upon themselves to scare everybody. They call themselves the Twin Terrors. So it opens up on Halloween night. Dwayne is dressed as the Grim Reaper, and Stephanie is dressed like a giant cat-like creature. They decide not to go trick-or-treating, but they decide that it would be a lot more fun to scare kids instead. And so they go around the neighborhood scaring all the trick-or-treaters and taking the spoils of the kids' candy. After a night of scaring the neighborhood, so Dwayne says, "And I wish that we could do this all the time." Stephanie's like, "It doesn't have to be Halloween to scare people." And then she suggests to Dwayne, "Hey, how about we go to Hill House and take the tour again?" It's about 10 o'clock at night, and they say, well, the last tour starts at 10:30. So they make it to the house just in time for the last tour. And they're such regulars at Hill House that they aren't even asked to pay anymore. They know the tour guides. They know their every sentence, their every move, everything that they do while doing the tours. And there are a lot of scary stories that surround Hill House. And then he goes on to tell all of these stories. It was a house that was built around 200 years ago by a sea captain. The day that he finished, he was called out to sea. He left his wife Annabelle behind, and he never came back. He died out at sea. And then his spirit came back to haunt the house, searching for Annabelle, his wife. And over the next 100 or so years, families would move in and report that they heard ghostly cries calling for Annabelle. And then there's a family that moves in called the Craws. And there's this kid. His name is Andrew Craw. And he's a petulant little child. He likes to play tricks on his servants. One night, he goes after the ghost. He goes searching for the ghost. He finds a secret room, and he finds that there's a lantern that's lit. And he discovers the ghost of the sea captain. And then the sea captain reaches over to Andrew's head. He grabs him and he pulls Andrew's head off. And then he hides Andrew's head somewhere in the house. And so now there's the ghost of Andrew looking around the house for his head. And then there's a story about Hannah Craw, who was Andrew's younger sister. After discovering that Andrew had his head pulled off, she went completely insane. She collected porcelain dolls and decorated her room with hundreds and hundreds of dolls. And she never left that room. She would sit in her rocking chair all day, every day in the corner, just playing with her dolls, until eventually she died in that very rocking chair. There's a ghost story of Andrew's mother who fell to her death down the stairs. There's a story of Andrew's father, Joseph, who, after Andrew's death, came into his study and rested by the fireplace. And he fell into the fireplace, and all that was left of him were his charred hands gripping the mantelpiece. You realize the demise of the entire Craw family. great ghost stories too. So Hill House is haunted by several ghosts, and Stephanie and Dwayne try to separate from the tour, and they realize a boy who just sort of suddenly appeared in the group, and he's just staring at them. Dwayne says to Stephanie, "Hey, look at that kid over there. He's kind of weird looking at us like that." And Stephanie just kind of says, "Oh, whatever, just ignore him." And then eventually they sneak upstairs away from the tour group. And then they begin to explore the different rooms and to go off and look for the ghost's missing head, Andrew's missing head. They come across one room that is called the Green Room. The story behind that room is that one time a couple had spent the night in that room, and when they woke up, they had rashes all over their bodies that no one knew what they were. And then after they leave that room, this part of the book really makes me mad. Despite this being my favorite Goosebumps book, this is the stupidest fake out scare I have ever come across in the Goosebumps series. They go over to Andrew's bedroom, are looking for the head again, and they think that they see it in the corner of the room. The head falls and it rolls over to them. And Stephanie, she starts screaming, freaking out. And Dwayne picks it up and he sees that it's actually a bowling ball. More with that later. They continue the search for the head. They walk into the restricted area of Hill House, a place where the visitors aren't supposed to go. And they go down to another door that leads into another room. Pretty soon they get scared by a group of cats that are staring at them in the dark with their piercing eyes. And after that they say, "Well, that's enough for tonight. Let's go rejoin the tour group." And so they walk to the end of that hall and they hear a lot of voices coming from behind a closed door. And they say, "Oh, well, this must be the tour group." And they're saying, "Well, no, there's no way. The tour group doesn't come up here." They, "Well, what else could it be?" So they open the door, and then this room that just had a bunch of voices seconds before is completely empty. They kind of freak out, and then they just run, are looking for the way back downstairs to rejoin the tour group, which pretty soon, of course, they do. They find Otto, the tour guide, just as he's making his way up, and he escorts them back to the group. They say, "We don't want to rejoin the group, we'll just go home." Once they get outside, then they hear a voice that says, "Did you find my head?" And of course, it is Andrew, the ghost of Andrew. They turn around and Andrew's not there. Then they see the same kid from the tour group that they didn't recognize. And he introduces himself as Seth. And he says, "Well, hey, do you want to see some real ghosts? I've seen real ghosts in there. I once saw a ghost of an old woman standing on the top of the stairs and saw her eyes burning bright red. And she floated down the banister, howling like an animal, and her red eyes left a red trail behind her. So you need to come back after the tours are done." So Stephanie particularly gets really excited, and she says, "I want to see a real ghost." And then they say, "We'll meet here tomorrow at midnight, and we'll sneak inside to see if we can see some ghosts." And Dwayne kind of says, "Well, I don't really know," but he does agree. The next night, Dwayne sneaks out, and then Stephanie sneaks out. They make their way to Hill House, and they see Seth waiting for them outside by the back entrance. He's all freaking out when they get there. He says, "Ghosts are attacking me, ghosts are attacking me." But of course, he's not being serious. They all get inside, and Seth says that he's going to go get some candles for them. Once they get their candles, Seth takes them and shows them a dumbwaiter, and he says this dumbwaiter is haunted. The chef would put food on this dumbwaiter and then hoisting it up to the second floor, and the food was gone by the time it reached the second floor. And then he proceeds to tell another ghost story about a few children who were once visiting the house. There was a kid named Jeremy that decided he wanted to ride the dumbwaiter to the second floor. So he climbs inside, and then between the first and the second floor, the dumbwaiter just stopped. So the other children are worried about what's happening. They're freaking out. And after a long time, the dumbwaiter comes crashing back down to the kitchen floor. And where Jeremy was sitting, there were 3 dishes. In one dish was his heart, in another dish were his eyes, and in another dish were his teeth. And then Seth brings Dwayne and Stephanie into the pantry. Once Dwayne and Stephanie are in the pantry, Seth turns around and he locks the door behind them, trapping all 3 of them inside the room. And Seth, he refuses to let them go back out. He says that he played a little trick on them and that his name isn't Seth, that his name is Andrew. And they say, wait, you have a head. You can't be Andrew. He says, well, I borrowed this head. I have to return it, though. And I need to take your head, Dwayne. Dwayne, of course, is very much opposed to this. And honestly, it's quite convincing. In the end, it turns out that this was all an act. But Seth's act is very convincing. He says, I need your head, Dwayne. And he's moving very creepy toward Dwayne and threatening to pull off his head. So Dwayne and Stephanie are running for their lives, and they find a secret passageway and run down that passageway. And then at the end of the hall, there's a ladder that leads to a hole in the ceiling. So they start to climb up the ladder, but it breaks. It breaks off of the wall, and then they fall back to the ground. After everything is done settling down, the pieces of debris and the ladder and, of course, the kids, they see a ghostly head on the other side of this wall. And so they found Andrew's head. They turn back to Seth, and Seth is mortified looking at it. And then from the ceiling, a ghost with no head floats down, picks up the head, says thank you, and then floats away. And that, of course, was the real Andrew. And then, bursting into the room, comes Otto, who turns out to be Seth's uncle. And he says, are you trying to scare people again? Are you pretending to be a ghost again? The kids say, Otto, we saw the Headless Ghost. We saw him. And he says, okay, whatever, get out of here. From then on, Dwayne and Stephanie, they've stopped scaring people. They think that the days of scaring kids are behind them. They both pick up some new hobbies. And then, months after this happens, they walk by Hill House and they say, you know, let's take the tour again, just for old time's sake. And so they walk in the door, and then Otto is there. He says hello to them, and Edna, the other tour guide, says hello. And they say, hey, Otto, can you take us on the tour again? And he says, yeah, I can take you on the tour. I'll grab my lantern. And so they finally go on another tour of the house, and they're all alone. It's just them and the tour guides. And in this part, you realize how much it is that they've grown, how much they changed, because they don't take delight in scaring people anymore, and they don't get scared themselves anymore. And then after the tour is done, Dwayne and Stephanie wave goodbye, and they start to make their way down the driveway. And a police car pulls up. He says, what are you kids doing? And they say, well, we were just taking the Hill House tour. And then the officer says, no, you haven't been. They haven't been giving tours at Hill House for months now. And then Stephanie and Dwayne turn around. They look up. And then, through the curtains, they see Otto and Edna in their ghostly forms. And then the light goes out. This book is my favorite. I love this book. despite the fact that it contains the stupidest fake-out scare that I have ever read in a Goosebumps book. Seriously, a bowling ball and a ghost head, you cannot mistake the two. Dang it, Stine, why did you have to write something that is that ridiculously stupid? But apart from that, the atmosphere of this book is impeccable. It is immaculate. The build-up of all the ghost stories, which there are many, the build-up is so intense. I think that the characters are really likable, and honestly, I think that a lot of the reason why I like this book so much is because this was the very first Goosebumps book I ever read. And so it definitely has the sentimental value in my heart of being my first Goosebumps book. With that value, nothing else can compare, really. But even with that aside, again, the atmosphere is amazing. The ghost stories are enjoyable and at the same time can be quite scary. And in this book, even the fake out scares a lot of times will add to the story rather than detract from it. Except for that fragging bowling ball scare. But anyway, yes, this is my favorite Goosebumps book from the original series and possibly of all time. And there you have it. My rankings of all 62 of the original Goosebumps books. Remember to keep in mind that these are only my opinions. Of course, you will probably have different opinions than me. Make sure to comment down below on what your favorite Goosebumps book is and why. So until next time, have a scary day, everyone.